One thing we've got 4 panelists in this session, and they all have a lot to say. What I haven't told them yet is that when they have 2 minutes left, they're going to get a yellow card. And if they continue to speak past the time, they're not invited to the next one. But we don't mind this Canavan entity. So we have this great panel, and we want to leave lots of time for your questions and your comments. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you who's on the panel right now and the order in which we'll speak, and then I'll let our panelists take over. We're going to first hear from Victor Murinde, who's the AXA Professor in Global Finance at the University of London. He's also the founding director of the African Development Institute at the African Development Bank. He is going to talk about capital flows of all sorts in Africa, and he's going to be really optimistic. Okay, next we'll have Aart Kraay, who's Deputy Chief Economist at the World Bank. And Aart is going to talk about issues surrounding debt sustainability, as well as transparency. Things might get a little darker at this point, okay? Then we'll hear from Chris Canavan, who's managing partner at Lion's Head Global Capital, and who's maybe not the most optimistic of us about the state of the world, right? But maybe, we'll see. And then finally, we'll hear from Jill Dauchy, who's the founder and the CEO of the Potomac Group. And Jill is going to continue along this line of worry and pessimism, and the world is falling apart. But at the end, she's going to give us reason for hope. Okay, so it's going to be like joyous, and then less so, and then joyous again. So that's where we're going. Am I right? Okay. So we're going to hear first from Victor Murinde.
Thank you, Layna, and let me thank the organizers for inviting me here to speak, and in particular Leonard for this privilege. I'm going to speak about managing capital flows in the context of this session. And the general question for this session in terms of how can macroprudential regulation be designed to support the development goals and effectively manage the risks of engagement with international financial markets. And I'm going to just reduce it to 3 main questions. The first is, what are the main risks of engagement with international financial markets? And here looking mainly at the main transmission channels of global credit market shocks to credit cycles in developing countries. The second is to look at what specific macroprudential regulations can attenuate the virility of these shocks. And then assuming that we have identified the main risk, their transmission channels, and also identified the macroprudential regulations that can attenuate these shocks, then I pose the question on whether foreign private capital flows can actually be managed to deliver productivity growth and development. And if so, in terms of which sectors of the economy. And this work is actually taken from ongoing work with a number of colleagues, Francois Batiano and Issouf Somare at Laval University. And the second paper on private capital flows and productivity in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's a capital allocation puzzle matter, also with the Batiano, Somare, and with Stephen Griffith-Jones and Julius Tyson at Griffith-Jones at Columbia and Julius Tyson at ODI. So let me start with the first question, which is looking at the transmission channels of global credit market shocks, these risks. And basically, I look quickly just to look at the literature, gives us just some good highlights. Traditional literature on the global push and pull factors, which drive cross-border banking capital flows, the work of Bruno Sheen, Grop and Radev, and Kraay and Taboda in 2015, identified these factors, and they were very well known in the literature. But also some of the developments in theory, especially the bank network theory, is very relevant here, which actually claims that the structure of the bank interconnection plays a very crucial role in the financial contagion across banks. And stemming from the work of Asemo Guru in 2015, Bernard and others, and also actually to include the important contribution by Sigis in 2010. So banks here play an important role. But what channels have we actually identified today in existing work? So the channels of the transmission of these shocks, or the risks in the capital flows that we have managed in this session, is, for example, identification of housing prices. The work by Cesar Bianchi in 2017 is very helpful here, and documenting quite a huge number of countries. But also the transmission channels through exchange rates, which brought together just a broad canvas on exchange rates. The work by Blanchard, 2016, and then again, Brun and Shin, 2014. And then if you look at it in terms of the assets, financial assets in particular, the asset prices, the work by Blanchard, but also work by a number of people at IMF in the IMF report 2017. Now, all these channels are very well known, but what is interesting is that there is a gap. And this is the gap of commodity prices. In spite of the importance of commodity trade, particularly in the balance of payments of developing countries, this literature is silent on the contribution of commodity price cycles to cross-border bank activities, at least the role they play in the interaction with other factors, if not on their own. So in one of these papers here, we address that question of commodity price cycles. Then the second part of my presentation will look at what specific macroprudential regulations can attenuate any of these shocks. And I look at the broad composition of macroprudential policy, defined, primarily the use of prudential tools to limit systemic risk, work that is actually cutting across the board, where IMF, Financial Stability Board, Bank for International Settlement 2016. And then I look at what actually Basel III could do, containing systemic risk. But then I think the important thing here is to look at the key elements, the key tools that could be of use. And I will just cover this until just report on what we've done. And to combine all this analysis, I will draw upon the work that we took the largest number of countries, basing on the bank interconnection theory of Asemugro and others, in which we then design a simple model, which can serve the purpose, for testing for the direct effects of cross-border banking capital flows on domestic credit cycles, which is the argument here. Just a simple model in which we're able to embed the capital flows. Extend this model in many ways of including all the channels, including the commodity price transmission channel that we have argued here in the second equation. And then also looking again now, identify the channels to look at the effects of macroprudential regulation, and therefore being able to do the entire analysis that encompasses two questions, the first and second question that I'm addressing now. So again, data is available from quite a number of sources, the BS, allocation, bank statistics, very helpful, especially identifying the banks, as traditional IFS, UN Comtrade, World Bank, WDI, take 74 countries, a large sample, 94 first quarter, 2050 third quarter. But then we need actually to be able to focus on the contribution of commodity price cycles. So we spent a little bit of time here on looking at taking a method that was generally proposed by Dayton in 1995, then also used by Groos 2014, and then the extension by Garwar in 2017, in which we're actually looking at the commodity price cycles, including the number of components. So the idea here is that basically one is to look at various sectors of commodities and various types of commodities, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. And from that, one can then work out the index that gives us the unit value of, say, manufactured exports, because the exports here are playing an important role. This is designed, and of course the basis for getting the weights, which are very important in an index number theory. But then importantly then, having tied down that, then we can be able to look specifically in detail also at the macroprudential tools. You see, most of the work takes macroprudential regulation until it is, one size of it. We explore the heterogeneity of these tools. And basically here are 17 tools. Okay. Capital requirements, loan loss provisions, limits credit growth, loan restrictions, limits foreign exchange positions, liquidity limits, and we are then able to do kind of this decomposition. This decomposition allows us then, these are fun, 17 indices of prudential regulation here in the tools, and then to be able then to construct sub-indices, 5 sub-indices that can look at actually which tools specifically play a role. These 5 are important because they're able to enable the regulators, the central banks and others, to actually target the macroprudential specific shocks. Credit cycle-oriented, MC, foreign position-oriented, borrowing conditions, financial institution-oriented, and this is how this is combined together. And then also to look at that some of these tools may work in the short run, but not necessarily in the long run, and therefore can be able to actually entangle the short run and long run dynamics. And also then, of course, trying to see whether this is tenable in the long run trajectory of these economies. This is just a snapshot of the results. The details are in the paper. We're going to see that the bank capital flows are so important actually in the transmitting the shocks from developed countries, industrial countries, to developing countries in the short term, but also in the long term. So the short-term and long-term positive relationship between the capital flows and balance sector is found across all equations, even doing control and robustness. But also, we now look at a lot of commodity price cycles, and basically by trying to see the interaction of commodity price cycles with, for example, the capital flows by banks, cross-border banks. And yes, that is, we find that that's important, you say, in Economist 4 and 5. Okay. So basically, in all the regressions we have taken, we find evidence of positive effect of cross-border banking capital flows on credit cycles. It's a big transmission channel. And even when we introduce commodity prices, we find that the cross-product, the interaction between cross-border banking capital flows and the commodity price cycles is positive, suggesting that actually the commodity price channel of transmission, previously ignored, not paid attention in the previous literature, is possibly a greater omission that we can address here. So now then we go into the nitty-gritty of looking at the important components of prudential policies, and which we will modify actually the policies, the credit cycle-oriented policies, here in the red, the foreign position-oriented policies, the financial institutional policies, but not borrowing conditions. That's straight, not borrowing conditions. So basically, our conclusion here is basically that prudential regulation tools aimed at damping credit cycles include reducing foreign exposure, preserving the safety of financial institutions, and prudential regulation focuses on borrowing conditions is very tricky. It does not work as a tool. Then, given that basically we understand the transmission mechanism, we now are able to say we can identify which macroprudential tools can be used to target and reduce the shocks. Can then we then have an insight into whether foreign private capital flows can be managed to deliver productivity growth. So again, when I take a big innovation because of the controversy in the literature, capital flows could be positive, as in Eisenman and McDonald, but it can even cause financial crisis, especially if the flows are short-term and visible, as we know in the literature. We take a simple theoretical model based on extensional production function, identify foreign capital and domestic capital, and then test it on 18 Sub-Saharan African countries for 2006-2015. Now, the important dimension of that study is actually to be able to look at key sectors. And the argument is that it does matter which sectors of the economy the capital flows are going into, whether it is financial services, tourism, extractives, and infrastructure. That does matter. So we're able to actually compose the data into these sectors. Okay, and then plot the data. We find, what did we see in this chart? basically, the extractives, big component of total capital flows to Africa, big component of ADA flows, actually quite overriding the other sectors. And when we subject it to empirical investigation, we find actually that total capital flows play an important role in each of these sectors in improving the total factor productivity. But alas, not so the same in extractives, negative side, and not so the same in infrastructure, which is a puzzle. Why? Is it high corruption cycles in that sector? Okay, what is it? Okay. So in terms of conclusion, basically, number one, in the first question, we uncover new evidence that credit market conditions in developed countries are transmitted to developing country credit markets through a number of channels, including commodity price cycles. And secondly, it is possible to identify macroprudential policy tools which regulators in developing countries could employ, and especially three main important tools that could be used to dampen the effect of credit cycles. And thirdly, we uncover new interesting finding that the effects of flows on productivity, we have to reflect the heterogeneity of the various sectors in which this ends. And Sub-Saharan African countries may design policy incentives to prioritize some key of the sectors where foreign capital flows indeed works, according to this evidence. Thank you very much.
About to prove that all of us are mute without PowerPoint. But thankfully it's back, so I can say something. So thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks Layna and colleagues for the invitation to come and participate in this panel. Even though I was introduced as, I think, the killjoy, or the beginning of the killjoy of the panel. So I'm not sure that my remarks are intended to be particularly negative or positive. They're more intended to be descriptive. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking a bit about sort of what we mean by debt sustainability, and also why we emphasize so much the importance of debt transparency in a lot of the policy dialogue at the World Bank, and particularly in the context of low-income countries. I'm obviously not, for fear of getting a red card, going to be comprehensive in any way, and I'm also not going to talk about sort of specific countries or specific sort of debt negotiations. Maybe we'll let Kathy from the fund handle that particular hot potato that's going on. Also, you know, there's an acknowledgement of thanks at the bottom. There's also a disclaimer that I'm speaking in my personal capacity and on behalf of the World Bank. So let me start by just showing a couple of simple pictures that I think are informative for thinking about debt sustainability in low-income countries in general, which is the blue line, and African countries, which is showing, which are countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, which are in the red line. And here, sorry, the vertical axis label is a little small, but this is just the combined external debt to GDP ratio of this group of countries. And so, you know, we see this upward trend in external debt burdens. It's more pronounced in Sub-Saharan African countries. I mean, debt ratios, again, the aggregate sort of sum of all countries' debt in the numerator, sum of all countries' GDP in the denominator has increased roughly by a factor of 2 over the past decade. So there's two important things to bear in mind when looking at this. A lot of the policy discussion around debt often sort of focuses on the impact of the pandemic and about debt accumulation during the pandemic. I think one sort of very clear fact that you get from this graph, right, is that most of debt accumulation was before the pandemic. I mean, if you sort of squint closely at the last bit of the line, the last period is 2020. I'll tell you about 2021 in a moment. But yeah, there's a slight steepening of the line, but most of the the stock of debt that is external debt that is owed by low-income countries as of now was accumulated before the pandemic rather than during the pandemic. The second interesting observation, and again, sorry, it was just a question of mismatch between two data sets. We do also have the data for 2021 now. And in 2021, actually, there's sort of good news in the sense that if you think this graph is bad news, that the external debt to GDP ratio in low-income countries is declining, mostly on the strength of a resumption of growth post-pandemic. But this is a very particular and short recent period. It's also useful to sort of zoom out and look at the longer-term picture. So this is exactly the same graph, same color, same lines, but since 1970. And I want to draw your attention mostly to basically to the difference between the last 10 years and the sort of 30 to 40 years that are represented before that in the graph. I think one of the most important things to bear in mind is that a lot of this recent debt accumulation that you see starting in the late 2000s and early 2010s followed a program of sort of massive debt relief, both from multilateral official creditors, bilateral official creditors, and private creditors in low-income countries, particularly through the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, multilateral debt relief initiative process that sort of played out in the first half of the 2000s. So we had this massive reduction in external debt through, and I'm going to be talking about numerators and denominators in a minute, but it's primarily through reductions in the numerator of debt ratios. And then we've had quite rapid reaccumulation also through numerators. So let me, before I come to that slightly more analytical point, let me also just, so this is a graph that, if you spend 5 minutes hanging around the World Bank or the IMF, you sort of see all the time because it's, it's actually kind of important, right? It's showing the number of, the fraction of low-income countries that are rated as being in high risk of debt distress. So those are the red bars that are at the top. So the countries that are rated at high risk of external debt distress or are already considered by the bank and the fund to be in external debt distress has doubled since around 2011. And that is perhaps not that surprising, seeing this picture of rapid debt accumulation. So I want to take a moment to explain in a little bit more granular way sort of what we mean, at least on both sides of 19th Street in Washington, D.C., when we talk about debt sustainability. So I'm going to so this is like the one equation super stylized rendition of the World Bank IMF's joint debt sustainability framework for low-income countries. And it basically says that external debt is unsustainable if debt ratios, so we have D over Y representing, pick your favorite external debt indicator, GDP in the denominator on the left-hand side, if that's greater than a threshold, a policy-dependent threshold, and external debt is considered to be sustainable if debt ratios are below these thresholds. In the next slide, I'll add just a tiny bit more sort of nuance and granularity to that, but there's a couple of sort of key takeaways when you think about this sort of very simple way of assessing whether external debts are sustainable. So the first thing is that, I'll come to the numerator and denominator on the left-hand side in just a moment, but I think the one sort of key feature of the LIC debt sustainability framework is that the thresholds that we use to assess debt sustainability are themselves functions of policy. So that's what this sort of D star of P is. And I think because Layna used the word duh in her previous slides, I'll kind of say that here as well. This is sort of a duh thing, right? So countries' debt carrying capacity clearly depends on the quality of policies and institutions through a variety of channels, right? So countries with better policies and institutions both are, better able to mobilize resources for repayment. There are also countries that are better able to ensure that the proceeds of external borrowing, particularly sovereign external borrowing, are well spent. So it's not surprising that there is this sort of strong relationship with policy. And this is something that I worked on in the early 2000s when we were first designing the LIC debt sustainability framework. And, now you look at that and you say this is sort of duh, but at that time, people were using simple rules of thumb, like extra present value of future debt service, the share of exports is bigger than 150%, bad, above, good. So there's, some the other way around, I guess. But there's an important nuance in our assessments of debt sustainability that we have the debt carrying capacity varying with the level of policy. So let me just very briefly say one or two more details, just so that I'm not completely simplistic about describing the LIC debt sustainability framework. The first thing is that, in this framework, we look at multiple debt indicators. So you see 4 different debt indicators that are considered in the LIC DSF in the columns here. The most important thing that I want to draw your attention to is sort of how strong that relationship with policy is in terms of allowing for higher debt carrying capacity in countries with better policy. So the sort of weak, medium, strong categorization is basically moving from sort of the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile of the distribution of policy. You can see that most of the debt ratios increase by almost a factor of 2 when you move through those gradations of policy. So that's going to be very important when we start thinking about how we assess debt sustainability. So I'm just returning to the previous slide, but I've put 2 questions at the bottom that I want to answer in the next 2 slides. So the first thing is that, well, if debt sustainability is assessed based on a debt ratio compared with a threshold, there's kind of 3 things that can move around when you're thinking about debt sustainability. The numerator of the debt ratio can move around, the denominator of the debt ratio can move around, and also, in principle, the quality of policy can move around. And if these things are sort of moving in the right directions, you could say have higher debt ratios that are, actually quite sustainable, or you could have, you can have a variety of possibilities. So why don't I just show you what you actually see in the data. So this slide focuses on 2 different debt indicators, nominal debt as a share of GDP and total debt service as a share of exports. Each dot represents a low-income country that's eligible for consideration under the LIC debt sustainability framework. Countries in Sub-Saharan Africa are colored in red. And what you have on the horizontal axis is the proportional change in the denominator. So the proportional change in GDP over the last 10 years. Yes, 2010 to 2020, and on the vertical axis, you've got the proportional change in debt, right? And so the first thing that you see is that, well, most countries are above the 45-degree line in both graphs. And that's simply telling you as a matter of arithmetic that debt ratios are rising over this period. So this trend in the increasing debt ratios is not something that is just 1 or 2 countries. It's in the large majority of countries that you see above the 45-degree line. The second thing that you see is that a lot of countries are way above the 45-degree line, right? So what that's essentially telling you is that debt ratios are increasing very fast, and they're increasing fast, not because necessarily countries have had very poor growth performance. In that case, we would see more of a slope to this relationship, but rather simply countries at all levels of growth performance have been borrowing an awful lot, and that's led to sort of large increases in debt ratios. Now, those increases in debt ratios wouldn't be worrying if they were accompanied by improvements in policy that made debt more sustainable, according to the simple framework that we use in the LIC debt sustainability framework. Yet this doesn't seem to be the case, right? So this is the same graph. It's a 45-degree line graph again, just showing one measure of policy, the World Bank's country policy and institutional assessments. Which I can tell you more about at risk of getting a red card, so we'll save that for Q&A. So just for timing, that's the. And so on the horizontal axis, we've got the CPIA in 2010. On the vertical axis, we've got the CPIA in 2020. The point is that you actually see relatively few countries above the 45-degree line, relatively more countries below the 45-degree line, and not very many countries very far away from the 45-degree line. So we've seen sort of rapid debt accumulation in the numerator, not offset in any way by rapid growth, and we haven't seen improvements in policy. And these things, 3 things coming together, are what are creating the really big concerns about debt sustainability. Okay, I'll just, in the interest of time, very briefly mention a couple more features that exacerbate the worries about sort of debt sustainability in low-income countries in general and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. So the one is that, one of the key features of debt accumulation, particularly in the last 10 years, is that there's been increased fragmentation on the creditor side of the market. So, if you look at sort of the overall increase in new loan commitments to Sub-Saharan Africa over the last decade, a big chunk of it is from private capital markets where These countries were not borrowing very much previously. Another big chunk of it is coming from China. And then IFIs remain the largest source, right? And I'll show you. And then on the debtor side as well, there's been a great deal of increase in fragmentation within individual countries in terms of who the debtor entities are. So one way you can see that is in this, very nice graph here, which is basically focusing on the set of countries that went through the HIPC process. The vertical line there shows the year of when HIPC, of the completion of the HIPC process. And the black line on the left-hand side shows the number of different creditor entities for each country, the average number of creditor entities. And then the graph on the right-hand side shows the increase in the average number of debtor entities, right? And the fragmentation on both the creditor side and on the debtor side is, sowing the seeds for greater complexity of subsequent debt restructuring to the extent that that proves to be necessary. And my colleagues who are speaking subsequently on the panel will have a lot more to say about that, I'm sure. Also, a worry is that by shifting towards private creditors, and particularly to China as a creditor, countries have been relying on much, much more pro-cyclical sources of finance. So this graph, for example, shows the reversal in Chinese flows to Africa that happened in 2019 and 2020. If you were to superimpose on this the same graph for the World Bank, you would actually see a strong counter-cyclical response for lending from official creditors. Let me wrap up with a few observations on debt transparency. Debt transparency is a little bit of a poor cousin in these discussions of debt sustainability, and that's unfortunate because of its importance, right? So you can't have discussions around restructuring of debt if you don't know who owes what to whom and on what terms. And surprisingly, and despite, very, great efforts on the part of, generations of my colleagues at the World Bank, for example, who work on the bank's debtor reporting system database, we still have very large gaps in coverage, even though reporting at the loan level is a requirement to access funding from the World Bank, which is one of the things that makes DRS such a great resource. So let me give you just one, and this is what I'll close on, is one picture just to give you a flavor of that. Of that difficulty in generating debt transparency, even from the side of the World Bank that is collecting debt data from debtors. So this comes from a blog and a paper that I think by now is out by my colleague Sebastian Horn and two of his co-authors that look at subsequent revisions between different vintages of the DRS database. So I'm sorry, I keep saying the DRS database like you guys know what it is, but when you go to the World Bank and you get debt data, right, which is what all of you do when you need to get debt data, that comes from the debtor reporting system database. So it's all aggregated up from loan level reports that countries provide every year, and that's the basis of our international debt statistics. And these statistics are imperfect, right? So if you look at subsequent vintages of the IDS database, you see very, very large revisions as both our ability to cover debt expands as well as debtor countries' ability to report on debt expands. So each one of these bars shows the percent revision in the stock of debt in 2016 that occurred over the subsequent 5 vintages of the IDS. So the total amount is $600 billion in debt that is sort of newly reported in subsequent, so it's not new debt, it's newly reported debt across different vintages of the IDS. And I'm saying this both to acknowledge the challenges of measuring debt well, and also to do a little bit of promotion for the World Bank's efforts to improve the coverage of this data, that you actually do see these improvements in coverage. So to wrap up, 3 quick points. One, just to remember, when thinking about debt sustainability, people very quickly start thinking, debt is high, we've got to reduce debt. And so people start thinking about the numerator. But it's important to remember that debt sustainability depends on the numerator, it depends on the denominator. With fast growth, high debt burdens aren't a problem, right? I mean, my home country, Canada, has been a debtor nation continuously since 1867 in independence, right? But because there's sufficient growth in the denominator, it's never been a problem. So, and then the third thing that matters is policy matters. So the quality of policy in the borrowing country matters immensely for debt sustainability, and we should also be thinking about how to generate the improvements that are needed on that side. Debt transparency, it's the poor cousin, but let's not forget, debt transparency because it's very important for making progress on debt issues. And the very last thing I wanted to say is just to remind all of us that while this session is focused on external capital flows and external debt, one shouldn't lose sight when thinking about sort of how is it that we're going to finance investment in Africa, for example? How are we going to finance investments needed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, to prevent the planet from getting fried by global warming, by, all of these things? It's very important to realize that external capital flows finance a surprisingly small proportion of the capital stock of all developing countries. So if you look in low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, and upper middle-income countries, and you look at the total value of the capital stock, and then you look at the total value of foreign capital, so foreign direct investment, foreign equity investment, that's generally somewhere between 5-6% of the total capital stock. And this is the same across low income, lower middle, and upper middle income countries. And external debt as well as a source of financing is on that same 5 to 7% order of magnitude. So while this session is about focusing on external capital flows, focusing on how you make domestic financial markets work, how you get them to intermediate capital between savers and investors, is probably a much more important question than thinking about what it's going to take to make external capital flows work. Okay, let me stop there. I hope I've provoked you a little bit for discussion, and looking forward to the comments.
No slides. Nope. Old school. Thank you. Thank you, organizers. Thank you, Layna. Thank you, Aart and Victor, for making half the points I was about to make. So I'm at no risk of a yellow card, much less a red card. Those of you who are trying to figure out who I am and looking in the program and see my picture, I also want to assure you that I own more than one sweater. I just like this one a lot. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, let me just reiterate a stylized fact which Aart put up at the beginning, and I think we're using the same list of countries. But of the 69 countries that I believe were in that histogram, the ones that qualify for concessional lending, 36, I think, are at high risk or in debt distress. 9 of them in debt distress, 27 high risk, and 19 of those 36 are in Africa. So the stylized fact to bear in mind is that, at least in my opinion, there is a global debt crisis in the offing, and that Africa will figure prominently in that crisis. Let me just try to unpack that stylized fact a little bit and see what some of the implications of this are, and make 4 quick points, and then sit down and listen to people who are much more knowledgeable about these issues than I am. The first point is that this crisis in the offing, if indeed it is in the offing, is what I would describe as a systemic crisis rather than an assortment of idiosyncratic crises. And I think the reasons for that are probably fairly self-evident, so this is a duh point, which I will make. I will make 2 or 3 other duh points. And by systemic, I mean that for most countries, it can, notwithstanding the important quality of policy that goes into debt sustainability, most of the proximate causes of this crisis are exogenous, right? It's the exhaustion of fiscal space as a result of the pandemic. It's a series of terms of trade shocks as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And now, of course, it is a financial shock emanating from abroad because the money center central banks are having to raise interest rates in order to reverse QE and to fight off inflation. And so the implication for me anyway is that if indeed there is a crisis in the offing, the historical parallels we should go to are not, say, Argentina or a few other high-profile but idiosyncratic crises, but rather the debt crisis of the 1980s or the debt crisis of the 1930s. And if you believe me so far, then it begs the question, is the international sovereign debt bankruptcy regime as we know it up to the task for contending with a crisis that will have the scale and scope of the crises of the 80s and of the 30s. I would further add, and this is point number 2, which Aart has already made, that this crisis, in fact, may be, in an important way, much more challenging than the crises that some of us remember from the 1980s and some of us have read about from the 1930s. I suspect no one in this room remembers that one firsthand. And that is largely because, as Aart already pointed out, the creditor base is much more heterogeneous than it was in the past. Now we're talking about, for the sort of canonical average country that's heading into this systemic debt crisis, creditors that include bondholders, commercial banks, Paris Club, bilateral lenders, non-Paris Club bilateral lenders, of which China is probably the most significant. More on that in a second. The multilaterals, the IMF, and the like. And among that very heterogeneous group of creditors, there's only one group that's terribly well organized, the bondholders, and everyone else is terribly disorganized. And so what we're headed into is a crisis that will be bedeviled by one big coordination problem. And that's why the regime as we know it for sovereign debt restructuring is probably less up to the task than the regime was going into the early 1980s or the 1930s. So that's point number 2. Be ready for big coordination problems. Point number 3. As many of you, maybe most of you know, there are many remedies proffered to deal with the financial crises, the debt crisis that we're headed into. But in my opinion, none of these remedies add up to a cure. There are suggestions about improving contractual terms, embellishing collective action clauses, new IMF instruments, reforming the multilateral development banks. Of course, there's the DSSI and the Common Framework. There's lots of proposals about how to recycle SDRs and the like. But to quote a line that I think is from the Cherry Orchard, when doctors have lots of remedies, it means that they have no cure for the disease, at least not yet. So I suppose this is the dark point that Layna was referring to in the narrative arc of this session. I would classify those many remedies into 2 categories. There's one set of remedies that wish away the coordination problems that I think are going to bedevil us, right? So collective action clause is a perfect example. The premise there, of course, is that with a little bit of extra creative financial engineering, we can somehow persuade bondholders to provide debt relief, irrespective of what other creditors in the mix are doing, which I think is wishful thinking. There's another set of remedies that are proposed that I think acknowledge the presence of these coordination problems, but so far have failed to identify who the coordinator is going to be in helping us resolve these coordination problems. I think the case of the DSSI, for example, is a good example of that. The G20 proposed the Debt Service Suspension Initiative back in April 2020. It was supposed to be a framework that would bring in all creditors to help provide at least some liquidity relief, if not debt relief. And in my opinion, it failed, and it failed pretty miserably. It failed because it failed to bring in the bondholders, and it failed to bring in the multilaterals, and it failed to bring in China. And so so there was an acknowledgement that there's a coordination problem, that there's creditor heterogeneity, and we have to figure out how to deal with it. But there's no identification of some central planner coming in and helping to resolve this coordination problem. And I would venture to say that none of these so-called remedies will get us very far until it's clear which major actor or actors in the system will exercise the political will that's necessary to, in fact, overcome these serious coordination problems. And this leads me to my last and final point, which is that if you believe me so far, and if we're thinking about what major actor might play this role, we should beware of what we wish for. As I look back at the history of sovereign debt crises going back, 140 years, it's evident to me, and I wonder whether others agree, it's evident to me that the powerful coordinator who's played this role in past crises has been motivated not by the interests of the borrowing countries, not by the interests of the debtor countries, but by other interests. So if we look at the Eurozone crisis, the Troika stepped in and helped resolve the debt crisis in Greece, but not because they were interested in Greece, but because they were interested in saving the Eurozone. If you look back at the crisis of the 1980s, the US and Japan and Europe stepped in to help resolve the Latin American debt crisis, but not because they were interested in Latin American borrowers so much as they were interested in saving money center banks. They were interested in saving the international financial system. If you go all the way back to the 1930s and you study the resolution of those debt crises, you realize that resolution, that major players like the US didn't really step in until late in the 1930s, not because they were interested in helping Brazil or Argentina contend with their debt problems, but because they were interested in making sure that these early flirtations between of Brazil and Argentina with the Axis powers didn't move beyond that. If you go back to 1902, my favorite debt crisis in Venezuela, which no one else knows anything about, but it's where I grew up, so I know something about. But it's also the debt crisis that popularized the phrase gunboat diplomacy. Teddy Roosevelt stepped in, not because he was so interested in helping Venezuela, but because he wanted to keep the Germans out of the Western Hemisphere. Hence, we had the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And if you go all the way back to the 1890s and the Barings crisis in Argentina, the Bank of England stepped in not to save Argentina, but to save Barings Brothers. And so my guess is that if and when a great power steps in to help resolve these coordination problems, it will be motivated, or they will be motivated, not by the interests of debtor countries, but because of some other interests. And this brings me back to Africa and to China, because if I had to guess, my guess is that if and when major powers step in, it will be China and the US somehow deciding that the resolution of the debt crisis that's coming matters to them geostrategically. And of course, as we know from much of the discussion up to this point, China figures very importantly as a creditor in Africa, so Africa will figure very importantly in the way this crisis gets resolved. No yellow cards, no red cards. I'm done. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Princeton and Layna and all of the other speakers on this panel. The challenge of going last after such brilliant speakers is that much has already been said. So there might be a little bit of repetition to some degree, but I'm hopefully going to have a little bit of a different spin on it. And I promise with Layna that I will also end possibly on a happier, more optimistic note. I say, kind of, let's see. So I'm going to also make kind of 3 points today. And the first, as we've just been hearing very clearly, is that the international financial architecture is failing low and middle income countries. And this affects particularly, but not exclusively, African countries. And the mechanisms and the internationally accepted frameworks for sovereign debt restructuring that were used in the previous debt crises are no longer effective. And in the old days, a sovereign would experience debt distress, call in the IMF, go to the Paris Club of official bilateral creditors, and the process would unfold fairly smoothly. And that was even with commercial creditors who were banks back in the day. But that system doesn't work anymore because, as we've heard, sovereigns are funding themselves with debt that is much harder to restructure. Multilateral debt, which has always been off the table for restructuring, Chinese debt, and Eurobonds. So now when a sovereign calls in the IMF, there's an immediate problem. The IMF, remember, is the lender of last resort, which makes it a very special type of creditor. And since it is funded through public money, it has to ensure that its capital will be repaid. So before it can lend money, according to its mandate, it needs to have assurances that the funds are not going to be used to pay other creditors an unsustainable debt. But in today's world, these financing assurances, as they're called, are impossible to deliver in cases where China holds a significant percentage of the debt. And let's be really clear here. The problem is not the private sector creditors. That used to be the case, certainly, in the early 2000s, but with collective action clauses, bondholders are today relatively easily corralled into restructurings. The problem today, as we've just heard, is a coordination problem amongst official creditors, and in particular with China. And in this circumstance, the IMF really is faced with three choices. First, pretend that it has the financing assurances, and I can be blunt because I'm a free actor here in the private sector and I speak for myself. And I would say that this is kind of what happened just recently with Zambia. We didn't really have financing assurances, but we really didn't want to go to the annual meetings without a program in place for Zambia. So we had some kind of soft assurances from China. I would argue they were not credible or specific, and the program went forward anyway. The second choice that the IMF has is just to ignore the problem and deal with it later. You get some consent from the creditor, in this case China, to move forward without their financing assurances. And this is what happened in Suriname. Or third, the choice for the IMF is possibly to use the lending into official arrears policy, which I would argue the IMF really, really, really does not want to use. And we can go, that's a deep dive into exactly what is that policy and why that makes it so complicated. And we can pick that up in the Q&A if you like. But this really brings us to my second point, which is similar to what we were just hearing, is that in debt resolutions, we are really good, we as the global community are really good at solving problems and being creative when we have something to lose. The global community, and by that I'm meaning really advanced economies or the creditors, can act boldly when it's in their interest. We saw this, as we just heard, with the US and others in the 80s and 90s during the Latin American debt crisis, which was really to save the US banks. The European Union acted really boldly in the 2010s in the Eurozone crisis. And again, you could argue that that was a lot to do with the French and the Germans' exposure. But the problem today is that African debt markets are small, uncorrelated to other markets, and do not pose that systemic risk to advanced economies. The only country that has a large enough exposure to perhaps be concerned is China. But China doesn't really know what it wants to do yet. It's still learning the ropes. It took Paris Club creditors 50 years to get to the point where they could write down their loans under the HIPC process. And let's just remember, even in the Eurozone crisis, the difficulty that European countries had in delivering debt relief to Greece. So China is going to need to lead this process, as we kind of were just hearing, but I would argue that they're not exactly ready yet. They participated in the DSSI and the Common Framework as a member of the G20, but I would argue that those were frankly half-baked concepts that were cut and paste from the Paris Club practices and didn't really solve the underlying differences that we have with China. And so right now, literally in the last few days, we are seeing the emergence of a new process, which we hope will have a forum where we will be discussing these real differences, and that is the Sovereign Debt Roundtable that is bringing together some key G7 countries, China, the World Bank, the IMF, as well as, interestingly, some private sector creditors. The IIF is there, as well as, for the first time, hearing some voices of some select debtor countries as well. So that is a very exciting, I believe, forum and an opportunity to have real discussions about how to move forward. And that brings me to my third point, and hopefully the optimistic one, looking at Layna, is the debt burden of low and middle income countries can become a global problem when you start to factor in climate change and all of our existential need to protect critical ecosystems. Low and middle income countries are paradoxically also home to the planet's largest and most important carbon sinks. And it is very much in all of our interest that these countries are able to finance the restoration and protection of these natural assets, and that they are able to invest in adaptation to climate change. If we fail, we can expect more food insecurity, political unrest, conflicts over resources, and migration. So suddenly, the debt of low and middle income countries now becomes a problem that is systemic to all. And the nice thing is that the others in the global community have been doing a lot of work in this sphere. So while us, the sovereign debt nerds, and forgive me for calling us all nerds, but while we were working on collective action clauses and debt sustainability analyses, frameworks, there were scientists out there working on setting global targets and frameworks for tackling climate change. So we have 3 very clear treaty-based conventions. We have the UNFCCC, which is on climate. We have the CBD, which is on biodiversity. And we have the UNCCD, which is the Convention to Combat Desertification. These are 3 global treaties. We also have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which, as we know, are all intertwined. Personally, my favorites are SDG 14 and 15, which are life below water and life on land. Seems like that would be kind of 1 and 2. And SDG 13, which is basically about climate action, is intertwined with those 14 and 15, because without 14 and 15, we don't have the carbon sinks, and we can't really absorb the emissions that we have. We also have a global deadline, 2030. So I think that is something that can focus all of our minds. Suddenly, this is not just a problem for China to solve. So we need to bring these 2 challenges together, debt distress and climate change. And for African countries, I would argue that this is possibly a huge opportunity. This would mean that international support for debt for nature swaps, the establishment of markets for trading carbon credits or even biodiversity credits, and other programs to scale performance-linked instruments are on the table. We also need to reintroduce, and this is coming back to this international financial architecture, a level of automaticity to the system, something that can give early comfort to the IMF, give those financing assurances early so that it can continue to lend and fulfill its mandate of ensuring stability. So I would suggest some key reforms. We can automate, and these, again, are just kind of ideas, but as we're sitting down at the Sovereign Debt Roundtable, I think we need to be kind of pushing the system to think outside the box and think as boldly and as bravely as we can, and as our predecessors have in the past. So we need to automate debt service suspension on debt owed to G20 members. This would be like making some of the DSSI features permanent. We can enshrine early engagement with all creditors, and again, coming to this point of transparency, but the IMF can also be more transparent earlier in the process with all creditors regarding the DSA. And this is a key point that private sector creditors have been asking for. We can also introduce automatic stabilizers into bonds and other debt documentation to ensure private creditor participation. This is building upon the concepts used in catastrophe bonds, GDP-linked bonds, and others. So I would argue that one interesting trigger could be a staff-level approval of an IMF program. So in other words, when a country goes to the IMF and negotiates a program and gets that staff-level approval, instead of currently now they have to somehow prove that they have financing assurances, which right now, because of that coordination problem we don't have, we could have that staff level approval trigger some sort of automatic standstill. And I also, again, would say that we can really use this innovation and momentum around climate and nature. I've seen the yellow card, so I think I will wrap up there, but I think, again, that the World Bank has a very key role to play in all of this, in these discussions about expanding their balance sheet and bringing climate into these discussions is important. And I would also highlight, again, all of the hard work that's been done in the UN system. And we should be really leaning on some of that in the triggers and in the sustainable finance innovations coming forward. Thank you.
Gather around and here's some questions. Take up some questions. I know it's tight space. So I'll just say, as a political scientist, I might lose my political science card if I don't point out that when we think about financial integration, the way Victor talked about, or we think about addressing debt sustainability and debt crises, these are problems that are also inherently political. So we could think about who wins and who loses inside countries from financial integration, or we could think at this point that Aart made about that sustainability is about policy as well, right? That is to say that your debt carrying capacity depends on policy, but of course policy is not only about capacity, but it's also about domestic politics and domestic interest. And then of course we can go internationally and think about why we don't have a very effective mechanism for restructuring sovereign debt and sort of the varying interest of creditors. And then finally, we could even think about how countries borrow in the first place, and this creditor heterogeneity that's there is partly the result of the kinds of instruments and the kinds of relationships they want to have. So that's my advertisement for political science, and now I can stop doing that. So I'd like to collect a few questions for our panel and then have them respond, and then we can do another round of that. We've got about almost 25 minutes because our panelists were so good at keeping to time. So we'd love to hear your questions. Yes.
Question for Jill. Do you worry that I like your idea, but it seems like it would take a lot of infrastructure that at this point countries don't have to just measure whether or not their commitments to various socially desirable goals are being met. And I think without those, I think the whole thing becomes empty. So I don't know whether that seems like a huge task to take on right now. If you really want to take that seriously, it seems like an enormous task to take on right now. To just build country by country, this is what we're going to measure and how we're going to make it credible within each country. And it's as someone who comes from measuring microdata, I would say it scares me, the idea. But I like the thought, but I would like then a huge global investment in developing those.
Zainab.
I guess my question links to a point I made during my presentation. Maybe it kind of goes beyond the purview of this panel, but I think it's still very, very relevant. There's a bigger issue of financing needs in low and middle income countries. You look at, let me focus just on Africa. The infrastructure financing gap per annum is in the region of $100 to $150 billion. And then when you add needs around climate adaptation financing, this is estimated at another $50 billion a year. Not to mention parts of Asia, when you add all of that, you're talking about $1–2 trillion actually financing gap. So what this speaks to is that the demand and the need is always going to be there. But it's not clear to me in the case of low and lower middle income countries in particular that there are sustainable sources of financing to ensure that these countries don't end up in debt crisis every 15 years or 20 years as we're seeing, because this is a constant cycle. When we address this debt crisis, it's going to happen again because the needs are there. So there's a bigger issue around sustainable finance, and there are some initiatives around trying to get patient capital, mobilizing institutional investors. So maybe the question, especially to Aart, and maybe he can't answer this. I know he's speaking in a personal capacity and he's doing research and all of that. I get it. I used to work. I worked very briefly at the World Bank. I get it. But I think I have to pose a question to him. Then for entities like the World Bank, is there need for more creativity? Right? There's all this discussion about trillions of dollars of private capital. You see some of the interesting Silicon Valley ventures or initiatives being funded, daycare for pet birds and all of those things. And then you're thinking about the actual financing needs in a lot of developing countries. Is there more that entities like the World Bank can do with respect to de-risking, providing more guarantees, being very serious and focused around maximizing finance for development, all of those initiatives, right? Because there's a need there that needs to be addressed.
Thanks. Is there one more question for this round? Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think I like the session as well, very much. And I would like to draw the connection between Victor's and presentation and the one done by Aart. And Victor established that commodity price channels are a very important one for the transmission mechanism. And then we look at the graph that Aart put on the sheet, and there was a tipping point, an inflection point around 2014, 2015, which was exactly that correlation between the commodity price shocks, what was called the ending super cycle, and that debt vulnerability accelerations. And the key question becomes, it's been a recurrent problem within the continent, quite frankly, where each time when we have those commodity shocks, we see a rise in debt. And at some point we have to find a way to really get out of that recurrence. Otherwise we have to be prepared for the next epic. Every 10 or 15 years. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we notice, working with IIF and Paris Club on the DSSI and after the pandemic, that there was a lot of cautious from countries which were actually very attached to access to market, and they were not really prepared to really go that route because of the Damocles sword that they expect from rating agencies. And what we notice now, after the fact is that many countries which went through the DSSI and despite the Damocles sword now have to pay more than those that abstain as a result of acceleration in interest rates. And if you take that forward, and the question I have is that going forward in those negotiations as we contemplate them, are the rating agencies remain a challenge in terms of really getting to that resolutions of the debt crisis? And then finally, at some point, looking at the experience of Argentina, we actually talked after the IMF that we made some progress on enhanced collective action clauses. Questions for Christ. And where are we on that enhanced collective action clause? Something we could actually deploy to address the current crisis. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we have enough for our panelists to address. Do you want to, Art? Do you want to start? We'll just move down.
Sure. I mean, some questions were directed specifically to me, but I'll try to react to a couple of points. Abhijit, you're always very polite, right? Because what you're saying is greenwashing, and I think it's a very, very real concern with the whole variety of instruments that people are proposing to sort of link climate to finance in general and to debt resolution in particular. And I think it's something that's worth considering very carefully. I mean, the measurement, in some areas measurement is more tractable than others. I mean, we can see emissions from space, so things like that, there's probably more hope. Other areas, perhaps less. I'm blending a little bit into Zainab's question because, but Abhijit's question made me think about this, which is we also have to sort of articulate well kind of a rationale for what who it is who pays for what when it comes to say some of these mitigation steps. And I think what's I think is important is to have a much sharper discussion about what exactly we mean by global public goods and being very precise about what dimensions of problems are global public goods that could conceivably be a justification for having greater resource transfers from rich countries to poor countries, which is a little bit also the questions you're asking about where the money would come from. If we just sort of wave our hands and say climate, global public goods, we don't make a lot of progress because we don't distinguish between the aspects of the climate agenda that are global public goods. Things like emissions, reduction, that even within emissions reductions, recognizing that there are large private benefits to countries from reducing emissions as well, right? So you close a coal-fired power plant, you save the planet, you also save the lungs of the people who aren't going to be breathing in as much PM 2.5 downwind from the coal plant. So having that sort of hard-nosed discussion about what exactly is a global public good, where we make a case for resource transfers and actual legitimate cost sharing across countries versus what is not, I think is a thing that's missing in the discussion. The other thing I would say in response to some of these questions about linking the meaning with financing is to, in a sense, be careful of gimmicks, right? And and I'll sort of give two examples of this. The one is that, in some sense, we don't need to do very complicated financial engineering, have very, carefully crafted green bonds if we price carbon. If we price carbon appropriately in every country, every bond is a green bond. Like you don't need to have green bonds that are different from other bonds. If carbon is priced right, which in principle countries can do through policy, every bond is a green bond. You don't have to worry about green finance. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but just to make the point of how it works. The other set of gimmicks that worries me a little bit is all of the proposals to make debt more like equity as a way of sort of encouraging the risk sharing. I think there were some things in your presentation, Joe, that were along those lines. And the problem there is that that sounds great, except there's also a thing that's called the equity premium, right? So the people who are going to be entering onto the other side of that transaction are going to demand a higher return in exchange for taking on the risk. So there's no free lunch in terms of making debt contracts more like equity contracts. I'm sure I haven't answered everything, and I didn't quite understand what you were asking about the rating agencies, but maybe that's something we can talk about over lunch.
Great, thanks. Chris?
I'm just going to. Thank you. On the measurement and the question about making debt contracts more like equity contracts, I'm not sure that that's quite the right way to frame it. I think that, and maybe I'm putting words in Jill's mouth, but I think that the goal is to make debt contracts less pro-cyclical than they are, right? And to introduce mechanisms that provides at least some liquidity relief, right, in the face of of some kind of shock, whether that's an ecological shock or some other kind of shock. And if you think of it that way, then yes, it's true that there are serious challenges getting just the right measure for what it is you're trying to introduce a contingency for. But it turns out that there are measures that are readily available that are very good proxies. And if we agree that we shouldn't let perfect get in the way of good enough, then they can serve as the basis, at least for these mechanisms and these debt contracts. The problem, as I see it, is that these parametric mechanisms in these contracts implicitly assume that the past is a very good indicator of what will happen in the future. And one of the signature characteristics of climate change, at least in my opinion, is that looking back is not a very good way of anticipating what's going to happen in the future. And that's what makes linking climate change related parameters to bond contracts, at least in my opinion, as complicated as it is. As for enhanced collective action clauses, yes, it's true that there has been quite a bit of financial innovation for the past 20 years since, at least in the US markets, Mexico issued the first bond with collective action clauses back in 2003. At the time, we knew that that was that introduction wasn't going to have much of a difference, but over the ensuing 20 years, there's been quite a bit of evolution, and so they work much better. They work very well in countries whose creditors are, by and large, bondholders. But for countries that have creditor bases that are as heterogeneous as the ones we're talking about, I don't think that they make much of any contribution to the way in which debt crises get settled. On the question of the rating agencies, you know, the only anecdotal, and I'm not sure I captured your question, but I think that as important as they are part of the problem in the sense that they contribute to the kind of pro-cyclicality of lending. It was very clear to me, since I still get invited to some of the creditor convenings, that the creditors were trotting out the rating agencies to scare the bejesus out of countries that were contemplating tapping into the DSSI. And all the rating agencies had to do was say, we take a very narrow view, we have a very narrow methodology. It's clear if we believe that there's any possibility that you're about to either miss a debt service payment, repudiate your debt, declare a moratorium, or even whisper in that direction, then we will have to take action. And that, I think, kept a lot of countries that might otherwise have considered the DSSI sitting on their hands. And so I think in that sense they're part of the problem, not part of the solution. Not because they're acting in their own private capacity in a way that's at variance with what they say they do. They're doing exactly what they say they do, but because of the role in which they play in the markets. I think I'll leave it at that.
Jill?
Yeah. Okay, so I think we probably have to have a whole other panel on sustainable finance next time. But I think just to touch on a few points is, yes, absolutely, I think data is key to all of this. But as I tried to say, I think there is actually a lot of work already going on in a lot of different spheres. And one of the interesting things I think that can be happening now is starting to kind of connect those dots. is that there's an enormous amount of work on not only just all of the sustainable development goals and targets and actions, etc., but also in the conventions and the various NDCs and the land degradation neutrality targets and the like. So we already have a system that is setting credible and ambitious goals. It is true that not all countries have the capability and the capacity right now to be tracking all of what they need to be doing. And some of the things that we have been thinking in various financing structures is instead of having early performance targets actually linked to an actual outcome, say a reduction in emissions, maybe the first performance indicator is actually being able to have a database or have the technology. So you can actually kind of, even within this, start to kind of get creative about building that infrastructure and reporting and monitoring and verification. And hopefully, if all of that is done correctly, you're getting away from some of the gimmicky, to use your words, and some of the rightfully criticized use of proceeds bonds, which the green bonds and blue bonds, which have often been kind of misused or just used as kind of greenwashing, and that if we actually can use real targets and real data and linking, we're starting to kind of change the nature of those bonds. And that brings me to a question of the financing gaps. And so one of the pieces of work that Potomac Group has actually been doing with the World Bank is actually quantifying these financing gaps for climate and nature, and really looking at a very granular level, country by country, like what is really needed. So we take the NDCs, we take all of these global targets as well as the countries' specific development plans in terms of climate and nature, and actually starting to kind of quantify exactly what is needed and what. And once you get into the really nitty-gritty details again of these NDCs, they are actually talking about what is mitigation, what is transition, what is adaptation, and what is critically important, what is conditional, what is non-conditional. So you can really, really get down. So from that big scary number, you can whittle it down. So for like one country, it was, the headline figure was like $15 billion. But when you really get down to it, like what is absolutely critical, like now, is $2 billion. And you think, we should be able to do that. Like we're good enough to get that done. So, and I think then it is getting creative about the sustainable finance, the types of instruments, and perhaps, as I like to think, crowding in this issue into the debt conversation, because there are many who say that these are two separate conversations. I want to bring them together. There is a lot, again, to unpack about how that money is flowing from advanced economies into where it needs to go. There's actually Katya Grachova, who is here at Princeton now, has done a fabulous paper on ESG criteria and how there is an income bias in those criteria. And so when you actually rely on those data, it actually skews investment away from low and middle income countries. In my speak, I say it says buy Sweden, right? So we need to kind of think of how to change or kind of reform that so that we're actually getting the incentives right. And again, kind of building on what was also said earlier today about the mismatch of technologies. And something that was in the keynote address yesterday from Vera about the Ferrari driving on the country road. And I think that's part of what's problem is right now, is that we have this mismatch in our financial infrastructures. We have this incredible advanced economies that have deep, like, we can't even fathom how deep and how broad these markets are, and all of the tools and sophistication that we have. And then we're trying to apply that into countries that really are driving on these country roads. And so we need to think creatively of how to build that kind of piping to kind of break it down and get that money that even is saying we want to have impact, we want to help this, we want to do this. But right now, none of that money flows to where it needs to go, and there's no way for it to flow where it can. And from a low and middle income country perspective, you can look at it and blame the credit rating agencies and point to problems in the system. But I don't really think that that's where the issues are. The issues are just we just don't really have those instruments, and we need to kind of figure this out. And I think we do need to get creative in this sovereign debt roundtable of how we can kind of bring some of these issues together. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Victor.
All of these are very, very interesting issues, and I think my colleagues have touched quite a number of areas. I just wanted to possibly focus on 3 points. The point raised by Zainabu on the financing needs of African countries. Yes, that's very important, especially the sustainability of some of these sources. You see, most of the work done in, say, corporate finance has not really informed us in terms of how we can deal with the financing of countries. In other words, the capital structure of companies, translating that into the capital structure of nations, and trying to look at the leverage of various sources of financing, nations. That's still like a lot of work in progress, in the sense that while you can do so for companies, for countries you look at the flow of funds and then look at the number of assets that the countries are holding and try to see the substitutability of some of these assets with the debt of this category and then some other types of financing. And then you can possibly, the country would have some leverage in terms of substitutability over time from one source to the other. This again, possibly some promising work in that area I've seen, but quite a lot of limitations. And when you come to African countries, of course, when you draw the flow of funds table, the number of financing instruments diminishes. I've never been able to go more than 6 sources of financing. When you then start working on substitutability, then also that kind of reduces the substitutability. So I think the problem is there. It will be depending on how these financing needs are for different purposes. That's when you get the total financing needs, what builds up actually the debt is for different purposes, and how we can actually deal with that is still kind of work in progress. It's a problem, and maybe we can be able to understand more as we continue to research some of these issues on the capital structure of nations and house stability, and even the pricing, the different prices attached to different transactions can help us understand whether we can be able to fulfill at least a good component of the huge financing needs for African countries, including for infrastructure, and how we can de-risk some of the finances. And of course, the issue that the comparison with the companies, it's a little bit remote, because basically companies could be, the financing needs can be met through mergers and acquisitions or takeover, from the mechanism of managing a corporate debt. But that's not true of nations. I can see, for example, Kenya taking over Rwanda when all the financing needs, although it can be subsumed in a kind of regional balances, and whether that could be maybe with the different mechanisms. So it's a big challenge. Hippolyte, you do raise quite 2 important interventions. The recurrent problems of commodity prices and commodity shocks and debt crisis. I agree. This has been quite a lot. And in particular, I think the important point is the amplifying role of commodity price cycles with the other, say, for example, cross-border banking flows I have shown in this, but it's actually also can amplify commodity prices, can amplify the exposure in many other financial transactions from financial markets. I mean, if you look back over the years, over the last 30 years, for example, of course, some schemes have been put in place. Commodity stabilization schemes have been put in place. And recent work looking into the pricing of future commodity contracts that works for African countries have been works. So how many countries actually are just operating future commodity flows using option shows, the hedging, the options, forwards, futures, and swaps. Okay, that's again the big limitations if you are to look at African countries. Maybe in the age of fintech, again, the experimentation in terms of what could be done. So there is an angle, but I think we need to explore more about how to break, to disrupt that link, strong link between the commodity prices and debt crisis. Quite rightly, you mentioned the role of rating agencies here. You are right. I think we shouldn't underestimate the explicit as well as implicit role of rating agencies. In my recent work with many other people, we are looking at the implications of climate risk on the cost of capital of nations. That's number one. And then another paper on the implications of climate risk on the cost of capital of companies. And the transmission mechanism works through the role of rating agencies. So you get a climate shock, whether it's an earthquake or when the climate risk shocks at time T. And then at time T plus 2, the macroeconomic indicators all go berserk. At time T plus 3, you go to rating agencies, downgrade immediately. You go to international capital markets, and then you get huge kind of premium. You go into debt servicing. And the shocks we have computed for Africa, in particular for the V20, the vulnerable 20 countries which are vulnerable to economic. And yes, indeed, that comes up. But it's the rating agencies which, that's a fulcrum. That's basically where the effect happens. So we cannot underrate the role of that.
All right, great. So I know that I am in danger of getting a red card myself, and that I'm all that stands between all of us and lunch. So one thing I've meant to mention before is if you are or you want to be a sovereign debt geek, Jill does have a lovely podcast about sovereign debt that you can listen to. But mostly I want to thank Atif, Pallavi, Ethan, and Leonard for putting together such a great panel and making me look good. So thank you, all of you, for coming.